All right, for real this time. So I'm Christine DeBella. I'm the program manager for ArchivesSpace. I wanted to welcome everyone to this. This is our 6th annual ArchivesSpace member forum. So it's wonderful to have so many of you with us as we convert our annual community tradition to a format that's befitting these incredible times. I wanted to thank everyone who's on the program today, everyone who helped behind the scenes, and everyone who's just taken time out of their day today or later this week to, in some fashion, be with us. I do also want to especially thank and acknowledge our community engagement coordinator, Jessica Crouch. She's done incredible work this year to put this program and event together, and also the many other events and activities we've enjoyed this year. It's a testament to her creativity, her understanding of our community's needs, and her incredible organizational skills, not to mention having to twist some arms out there that we've had such an excellent variety of programs. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that being a person who goes through the world right now is not easy. That's not to say that it ever is for many, but especially now. This event and what we do here isn't intended to ignore that. But if it helps today be a little bit easier, we're glad. So thank you for being part of this community. Now I'm going to turn things over to Jessica to really get us started.
All right. Thank you, Christine. And thank you for those kind words. I think you know how deeply uncomfortable they made me, but I really appreciate it. And welcome everyone, and thank you for registering for the 6th annual ArchivesSpace member forum. I am Jessica Crouch, the community engagement coordinator for ArchivesSpace. We have a really full schedule today, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to just take care of a few housekeeping items really briefly before we dive into the schedule. As you know, this forum is usually a one-day in-person event held in conjunction with the Society of American Archivists annual conference. We are continuing that tradition of holding this forum in tandem with SAA, but in a virtual format. Instead of holding all of the events of our annual forum in one day, we've spread them out over the next 5 days. All events will be occurring between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. Eastern this week. I've dropped a link in the chat will take you to the forum's wiki. That includes the agenda, some attendee tips, and links to registration for the events that are occurring later in the week if you haven't gotten a chance to register for those. You can leave and come back during these sessions as you wish. Your connection information will stay the same. If you do plan to attend any of the discussion groups or that are happening tomorrow, or any of the workshops that are happening later in the week, you will need to have registered for these separately. The workshops are all currently full, so that's great, but registration for the discussion group sessions is still available on the event wiki. We are recording today's sessions. The recording will be linked in the event wiki page in the coming days. If you need any help during the forum, please use the chat box, or you can email us at archivespacehome@lyrasis.org. But do keep in mind, due to the large number of attendees and that Christine and I are participating in the forum, we may not be able to resolve all of your issues, but we're definitely going to do our best. And before we begin, I would like to go ahead and thank all of our presenters, discussion leaders, our workshop trainers, everyone you will be hearing from this week. Each presenter will be introduced in their session, but I wanted to acknowledge them here as well. We couldn't have forums like this without engaged users willing to share their knowledge and experience with the rest of the community. So a sincere thank you to everyone on this list. And thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to a great week of presentations, discussions, and learning. Please feel free to chime in during the Q&As, connect with one another in the chat, or just enjoy time learning from other people using ArchivesSpace. And again, thank you for your flexibility and willingness to attend yet another virtual meeting. I know you're all working under very different and very stressful circumstances right now, so I appreciate you being here and directing your energy to the ArchivesSpace community. I'm looking forward to future in-person events where we can actually see each other and catch up, but for now, I am really happy to see so many familiar names in the chat sidebar. So with that, let's begin. Here we go. Today's first session is going to be a Show Us Your Plugin presentation. In this session, ArchivesSpace users will highlight a plugin, tool, or integration they've developed to make their ArchivesSpace life easier. We will hold all questions until the Q&A at the end of the whole session, but if you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and type it into the Q&A at the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen at any time. If you could, please indicate which presenter your question is directed towards, and please use that Q&A option, not the chat option. The Q&A option is what we're going to be recording and what we'll be saving and making available after the forum. So please do use the Q&A. I'm going to introduce all of the presenters for this session now, and then we'll dive into the presentations without any further interruption from me until the Q&A after. So first, Hannah Sistrunk and Erich Chang of the Rockefeller Archive Center will highlight Matchbox. Matchbox is a browser-based tool that matches archival objects to appropriate box sizes. This collections management tool is used for housing materials that require box sizes more specialized than standard record storage boxes or standard legal document boxes. It can also be used to calculate cubic footage or container profiles. Hannah Sistrunk is an assistant digital archivist in the digital strategies team at Rockefeller Archive Center. Her work includes user experience research and testing, front-end development, contributing to the documentation and maintenance of systems and processes, and providing training to empower her colleagues in their use of technology. Erich Chang is an assistant archivist in the collection management team at Rockefeller Archive Center. A graduate of Simmons College, now university, with a master's degree in library science, his work includes various archival preservation projects, management of preservation supplies, and the project management of archival accessioning for both digital and physical records. After, Joshua Shaw of Dartmouth College will discuss his Sitemaps plugin for the ArchivesSpace public user interface. Dartmouth has created a plugin that allows staff members to create a sitemap for the PUI to enhance Google and other search engine indexing and relevancy. He'll go over the general concepts, a basic overview of what the plugin does under the hood, the staff interface, and the final results. Joshua Shaw holds a dual position at Dartmouth College as part of the Ronner Special Collections Library and the Digital Library Technologies Group. He's the lead developer for Dartmouth Library's ArchivesSpace implementation and is also part of the library's web development team. Joshua created this plugin as part of his work in this dual position. Next, Matthew Stevens will discuss the image carousel plugin he created for the Atlanta University Center. This plugin adds an image carousel to a page on the ArchivesSpace public user interface. Matthew Stevens is a freelance web developer who has worked with the Atlanta University Center Robert W. Woodruff Library since 2015, working on a variety of digital projects. Previously, he worked at the University of Virginia Library during their early beta testing of ArchivesSpace. As part of their public launch of ArchivesSpace in 2018, the AUC asked Matthew to implement some customizations to enhance their patrons' user experience, including the image carousel, to showcase some of the library's archival collections. He's here to talk about the results of that effort. Next, Alex Dury from the New York Public Library will discuss Time Twister, a plugin that automatically parses date metadata in ArchivesSpace. Alex is the metadata archivist at the New York Public Library, where he manages and develops systems for archival description and discovery. He received his MLIS from Rutgers University. And finally, Corey Schmidt, ArchivesSpace project manager at University of Georgia, will discuss the batch exporter tool he created for Windows users. This tool batch exports records from ArchivesSpace in EAD, MarkXML, container label, or PDF form, and runs exported EAD records through a series of cleanup processes. Additionally, a user can enable the XTF version to upload XML or PDF files to their instance of XTF, a finding aid web hosting platform. So with that, I'll pass things off to Hannah and Erich to start us off with their discussion of Matchbox. Erich, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and feel free to share yours.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. So I'm Hannah Sistrunk. I'm here with Erich Chang from Rockefeller Archive Center to share this tool called Matchbox. So to give a little bit of context, Rockefeller Archive Center is an archives focused on the history of philanthropy. Our primary collection acquisitions coming from philanthropic foundations of varying sizes. And our archives unit is made up of over 30 staff spread out over 5 collaborative program areas. So we're a fairly large archival staff. And these program areas are reference archivists, processing, collections management, which Erich is a part of that team, and digital strategies, which is the team that I work with. And Erich, take us to the next slide. Erich's driving this train, so I'm gonna, okay. So Erich and I are gonna tell you about and demo an archival collections and space management tool called Matchbox that pulls container profile information from ArchivesSpace to help the user find the box size they need to house an archival object. So Erich's gonna do a demo and he's gonna talk specifically about the tool. But before he gets into that, I'm gonna just give a little information about our approach in general to ArchivesSpace integrations and plugins, and to sort of give you some context, hopefully, that folks can think about in relation to your own situations. So we have a few tools we've built over the years that use the ArchivesSpace API to help us with particular user needs. And overall, our approach has not actually been to build formal plugins for ArchivesSpace, but to build tools that exist outside of ArchivesSpace and use that API to get data and do something with it. So for example, we have a web-based tool called Find It, where a user can enter ref ID from ArchivesSpace and the app fetches location information about that archival object using the API. In the case of Matchbox, we are getting container profile data from ArchivesSpace. So the reason that we take this approach is that it allows us to try things kind of outside of the system in response to changeable, temporary, and maybe not yet well understood local use cases in a way that doesn't require us to take on a lot of technical debt in terms of programming languages we aren't as familiar with, maybe that would be harder for us to maintain over time, and the additional testing infrastructure necessary for an ArchivesSpace plugin. So in a way, we're responding, so in this way, we're responding to particular needs, but in ways that are adaptive and modular and ultimately disposable for us when we decide something is obsolete. Next slide, Erich. So for Matchbox in particular, I want to share a little bit about how this is built. First of all, shout out to Hillel Arnold, our Assistant Director of Digital Strategies at the RIC, at the Archive Center, who built this. It's a browser-based tool. He built in collaboration with Erich and other folks from our collections management team. And he did this using basic HTML, CSS. It pulls in Bootstrap for styling, which you'll see in a second, and JavaScript. So to my earlier point, these are languages we're familiar with and are more maintainable for us than JRuby in thinking about the ArchivesSpace plugin, our approach there. So it relies on a single, it does rely on a single ArchivesSpace plugin to enable cores, which is cross-origin resource sharing. Thanks to Mark Triggs and Mark Cooper, I want to mention, who both helped contribute to that plugin. And that is available on our Rockefeller GitHub, which we'll have a link to later on. But basically what that means is that since we are using JavaScript to make calls to ArchivesSpace, to get the data out from that API, we need some middleware that adds headers to the HTTP requests from Matchbox to let ArchivesSpace know that Matchbox is okay and is allowed to make those requests, right? So otherwise, for security reasons, it wouldn't allow that. So that's kind of, that's a very basic overview of principles and the technology for us. So now I'm gonna hand it over to Erich to get into the exciting stuff here to show you Matchbox, talk through the tool. And if you're interested in following along or looking at a demo of this tool yourself later on, there's a demo version of the site at demo.matchbox.rockarch.org. And that is just using static data, but feel free to check that out. And I'll hand it over to Erich.
All right, thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. So Matchbox came about when the Rockefeller Archive Center began to have a large number of container profiles with very similar dimensions and naming. This became cumbersome to search for specific boxes in ArchivesSpace, and we began to develop a way to repurpose the container information in ArchivesSpace to help staff identify boxes for their project. Matchbox is an example of how we used cross-collaboration between program areas to problem solve. to the benefit for the host staff. Special thanks to former staff member Julia Welby, now Gates Archive, and Emily Swanson from the Rockefeller Archive Center, who were involved in the planning and concept creation for the tool. One of the hardest things to do is finding the right sized box for your irregular sized materials, such as scrapbooks, three-dimensional objects, memorabilia, and oversized material. This is where Matchbox, our internally facing application, comes in. With the help of the ArchivesSpace API, we can track each distinct box that we have recorded along with their measurements. We have also added a feature that lets us calculate cubic footage directly on the application. AS only calculates totals in linear feet, but with Matchbox, we can now calculate cubic feet, since this is the unit of measurement we use at the Rockefeller Archive Center, which I will demo later. These features have not only helped the collections management team, but the processing team as well. So when you open up Matchbox, you can see a running list of all the available container information, container profiles, that we have recorded in ArchivesSpace. As you can see, some have check marks next to them, which lets our staff know that these are commonly used boxes here at the Rockefeller Archive Center, and that they are frequently stocked. This has also let us manage our supply inventory by understanding the different stock mix at the RAC. The first thing to know is the dimensions of your object you want a box for. Once you get your dimensions, you can input those dimensions in inches for the container profile or box in the space provided. As you enter your dimensions, it will auto-populate the results, as well as eliminating the ones that become too small. If there are no results, then there isn't an appropriate box for the material in the system yet. If staff members can't find a box, then they can let collections management know, and we can add container profiles to ArchivesSpace. Matchbox will pull and display the new data in the tool. You can also use the sorting feature of the different columns. So if you're looking for one particular dimension, this can help you get results quickly. Every institution will have their different criteria in terms of naming practices and measurements for their container profiles. Lastly, we've added a feature that lets you calculate cubic footage extent directly on the application by entering in the quantity for each container profile. The total cubic footage will populate on the bottom of the page in real time, as you can see right now. This has been extremely helpful because we no longer need to use the cubic feet formula, which is length times width times height, then divided by 1728, since there are 1728 cubic inches in a cubic feet. It has allowed us to calculate collections efficiently. The cubic footage calculator has helped not just the collections management team with space management, gathering end of the year statistics and project planning, but also staff from the processing team, who wants to estimate how big their collection will be, or adding the final extent to a finding aid in AS, since we all know space is a premium. Matchbox is growing every day since we are adding more and more container profiles into AS as we continue accessioning, processing, or completing preservation projects. Oops, too fast. We also added web analytics to it so that we can see what areas need improvements. It is great to see an idea skyrocket into a much needed tool here at the RAC.
Cool. So thanks, Eric. So this is Matchbox. It's free. It's open source. As I mentioned, it's available on our GitHub if you want to check out the code or clone it, see what if you want to try to implement yourself. And there's also a link to the tool on the ArchivesSpace forum event page on their website. So yeah, we're always happy to talk about this tool or any really other work that's going on at the Rockefeller Archives Center. Feel free to reach out to us, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Hannah and Eric. Joshua, you are up next. Feel free to share your screen when you're ready.
All right, let's go. Make sure I can do this. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. As Jessica mentioned, I'm the lead developer for ArchivesSpace here at Dartmouth Library. Bit of background, our instance of ArchivesSpace is used for both Rounder Library's manuscript collections and the college archives. We combine them both in the same library. We've been running ArchivesSpace for several years, and we've heavily customized both the stat side and the PUI, which we recently released. I'm happy to provide more information about how we've done those customizations if there's interest. But today, I'll be talking about a plugin I developed that creates a sitemap for the PUI. And I'll apologize up front for the lack of imagery. There's not a lot I could do to make an XML file look really exciting. I also couldn't think up of a clever title, so I went with the as boring as possible option. First up, what's a sitemap and how is that going to help us? A sitemap is just an XML file that lists the pages on your site. It contains a few key pieces of information: the URL of the page, the time the page was last updated, and the typical frequency with which the page is updated. It's exactly what it says. It's a map to your site that Google and other crawlers can use to index your content. It's a useful thing to have because it means the crawlers don't have to crawl through your site to create a list of all your pages. You provide it up front, and it's a lot more efficient. So here's some basic rules for sitemaps, because of course everything has rules. Sitemaps can only have 50,000 entries in them. There's also a size limit of 50 megabytes, but typically the number of entries is the limiter that you reach before you hit the size limit. If you have more than 50,000 pages on your site, you also need to create what's called a sitemap index file. And the sitemap index file is just a list of all the individual sitemaps that you've created. Within that sitemap index file, each entry has a URL, and there's also an optional modification date. Sitemaps typically live in the root directory of your site, though they can be hosted elsewhere. That's a little bit more advanced. The robots.txt file should have a line in it that points crawlers to the location of the sitemap or sitemap index file. So just for example, here's a typical sitemap file, and you can see that there's a URL, there's a last modification date, and there's a typical change frequency for each entry. And this, again, would be a very lengthy list. And again, here's a typical sitemap index file. And you see you've got a location and a last modification date for each sitemap part that you generate. So why do we want a sitemap for the PUI? There are a lot of pages to crawl, and most of them are archival objects that don't necessarily rise to the level of excitement that Google likes to see, however they create their crawling priority. For an example, Dartmouth, and we're a medium institution, we have about 300,000, probably a little bit more at this point, published objects in our particular PUI. Google's crawler may not crawl your site immediately, and it may not crawl the entire site for a really long time. That crawling priority is something of a black box, as with all things Google, and it's a challenge to know how and when your site will be fully crawled. Even though Google is supposed to handle crawling dynamically updated page content, there may also be some issue with the way that the PUI tree is rendered that makes crawling those links more challenging. And it's also important to note that even if you provide a sitemap, there's no guarantee Google will crawl your site in any specific time period. The sitemap only helps that process along. I decided to write this plugin mainly because we were about to launch our PUI, and we wanted to make sure we had as much exposure as possible for our new tool. And we wanted to make sure that our search presence was at least as great as it had been with our old Finding Aids site. And that was a flat HTML site, and was pretty easily indexed. And this has also been requested as a feature from the community. I've listed the Jira ticket there, and you can take a look at the conversation if you feel. So let's take a look at what the plugin does. It adds a new background job to the staff interface, which is cleverly named ArchivesSpace PUI Sitemap. You can see here our local list of jobs, some of which are customized to us, but the ArchivesSpace POI sitemap job is at the top. And you select the job as you would any other. Once you select the job, you're presented with a form that allows you to customize what the job will do. The first thing you can customize is the type of objects that you want to include within the sitemap. By default, everything that can be published is listed and pre-selected for you. You can deselect some of these, especially if you have some customization to your POI that means that you're not going to be publishing digital objects as their own entity. So moving right along, you're also given options to change the typical update frequency. Right now, this is a global option, which applies to all of the object types. In future releases, if there's interest, I could see this becoming an option that is tied to each specific object. So for example, if you think that you're going to be updating resources more frequently than you would archival objects, you could set resources to a monthly update and archival objects to a yearly update. If you're using a version of ArchivesSpace that supports slugs and you have them turned on in your configuration, you'll be given an option to use slugs for the sitemap. This is something you probably want to consider a little bit carefully, because if the sitemap, if the slug changes, then your sitemap would need to be regenerated and re-indexed because the URL would change. The next checkbox, this right to local file system, you can probably leave as is unless you plan to host the sitemaps on an external server. Essentially what this does is it directs the job to place the completed sitemaps in the correct location in your POI site. If you're hosting externally, this next sitemap index base URL can be filled in, but most people probably choose to ignore this. And you can also customize the number of entries per sitemap if you feel that you might be running into that 50 megabyte size limit. Again, probably leave this as is. So what happens when the job runs? The job does a few things. It queries the database for all published objects from the types you selected. It checks archival objects and digital object components for any unpublished ancestors. We don't want to include those in the sitemap since they're not actually visible in the POI. And it's important to note that the ancestor check that the plugin does uses the Solr index. So you want to have a completed POI index run before generating the sitemap. Otherwise, you may run into some issues where it'll find something but not be able to tell whether or not it has an unpublished ancestor. So once you've got a list of all the published objects, the job creates one or more sitemap files and a sitemap index file. It always creates a sitemap index file just because that's the way I structured it. It copies those files into the POI site root so that crawlers can find them. It also copies the sitemap files into a new directory in the standard data directory where you find your index files. It updates the robots.txt file with path to the sitemap index file. And it also creates a zip file containing the sitemaps and the sitemap index file for download if you happen to be hosting them on an external server. The whole process can take a while, depends on your server configuration, memory allocation for the application, and how many objects you have in your database and how many of them are published. For example, our typical run takes about 10 to 15 minutes, and like I said, we have about 250, 300,000 published objects. So under the hood, there are a bit of configuration at this point. Both of these configuration settings are optional, and both are metadata identifiers used by Google and Bing to verify site ownership. These are only really needed if you're manually submitting the sitemap files using the webmaster tools from Google or whatever the Bing equivalent is. I included Bing for completeness, but I don't know that anyone actually uses Bing. Other configuration options are set in the individual plugin init files, and we're getting a little bit into the technical weeds, but bear with me. One potential change that that could happen with the plugin is to move some of those additional configuration options into the global configuration area, so that an institution could customize some of the form options, like perhaps the type of objects that can be added to the sitemap, without going in and updating the actual plugin code. For the initial release, I thought that these additional settings would be changed so infrequently that it made more sense to bundle them into the plugin space. But that's, again, something I'd be happy to chat about and talk more about. The plugin also does a few additional things under the hood as far as storage goes. It checks for and creates a new directory in the standard data directory. And you can see this is my local development instance where I'm talking about. It creates this new directory called PUI_sitemaps. Again, cleverly named. And this is the persistent storage space, which we need since the PUI web space is recreated every time the application starts up. So if you just copied the sitemaps into the PUI site, they would go away every time you had an application restart and you'd have to regenerate the sitemap. This way, with persistent storage, you're good to go every time you restart the application. On startup, there we go. On startup, the plugin checks for this directory. If it's not there, it creates it, and that's okay. If it's there and it finds XML files in that directory, it copies those into the PUI web space on startup so that they're visible where you'd expect them. It also checks the PUI robots.txt file and updates it, if necessary, with a path to the sitemap index file. And I've given an example here of what a line you might find in the robots.txt file. Sorry about that. Okay. One tricky part of the plugin was trying to figure out how to tell the backend where the PUI web space is going to be. Since that's created on startup and is dependent on configuration, I needed some way to tell the backend where the PUI was going to be so that it could then, once the job is complete, put the generated sitemap files into the right place. So as I say, kind of kludgy solution is to have the PUI plugin init write a text file containing the web space path into the plugin space so that the backend job can then open up that text file and read the path. And that path is what's used to copy the generated files into the correct spot. And for example, this is something like what the path would look like, and that is all, again, dependent on your configuration. I had tinkered with an alternative solution, which involved setting up a URL in the PUI that returned an encrypted version of the path, which the backend could then decrypt. And the problem with that solution was that you would always be encrypting the same text stream, which means that the text and potentially, I guess, the key could be determined with enough repetition. There's some colleagues I have who are much more knowledgeable about encryption who were sort of key to letting me know that that probably wasn't the greatest solution. This is one of those areas where if others have a better idea about how to communicate this particular path from the PUI to the backend, I'd be happy to talk about that. The plugin uses both the database and the Solr index to create the sitemap files. The first thing that happens is that the database is queried to retrieve all of the published objects. So these are everything that the database is marked published true, basically. Once that set's gathered, the Solr index is then used to determine if any of the archival objects or the digital object components have unpublished ancestors. And I used the Solr index in this case because the index already has a simple true-false value for whether or not an object has an unpublished ancestor. So it's easy to query it and have to recreate the wheel. The only other check we do at this point is we check to make sure that the repository itself is published, just in case there's an unpublished repository, but the objects happen to be marked published. We don't want to include those objects either. So some additional options and some issues and some things that aren't currently supported at this point. You can choose to download the sitemap files if you plan to host them on an external server. When the job completes, it offers you an option to download a zip file containing those sitemap files. Slugs, as I mentioned, can be used in place of the standard URLs in the sitemap. That may increase SEO, search engine optimization, since human readable URLs seem to be preferred within the indexing ecosystem. As I mentioned, the downside to that is that if the slug changes, you'll need to have Google reindex, you'll need to recreate the sitemap, etc. ARCs are not supported at this time, but I'd be happy to think about adding that feature for future release. The reason that I didn't add them in for the first release was that I wasn't really sure if the redirects that ARCs employ will hurt SEO for the sitemap itself. Again, I'd be happy to add that in if people have a really strong opinion or just want to see that feature. I've tested this with versions 2.5.0 through 2.7.1. I haven't tested it against 2.8 yet, but I will be doing that shortly. I don't think there are any changes in 2.8 that would affect any of the back-end job pieces, but again, I'll be testing. The other thing that I'm thinking about, since this was a feature request from the community, is what the effort would be to make this part of the core code. And again, on that, I'd be happy to collaborate if someone is really interested in taking on some of that challenge. I know I'm really bad at writing tests, so that's one thing that would be a good collaborator. Somebody with a lot of experience there would be good to have as a collaborator. Otherwise, it's really just a question of finding the time to carve out all my other commitments, like I'm sure everybody else has. Just as an aside, as I was prepping this talk, I realized I had messed up some of the sitemap code, and I recently released 1.0.1, which has the latest fixes and all the good stuff, so that should actually work. And that can be grabbed from here. And as I said, the latest release is 1.0.1. Pull requests, anything like that, comments, totally welcome. And I'd love to collaborate with somebody if they're really interested. And I'm happy to take questions during the Q&A period. Thanks.
Thank you, Joshua. All right. Matthew, you are up next. If you want to go ahead and, yep, all right. You're good to go.
Hi. Yes, thanks. I'm just going to get everything configured here. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you all, even in this virtual capacity. It's my pleasure to talk to you about an interesting plugin project I had the privilege of being involved in. A word for those of you who aren't familiar with the Atlanta University Center. It's a consortium of 4 historically Black colleges and universities in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Robert W. Woodruff Library jointly serves all those institutions. And so I'm here to talk to you about a plugin that we built for our ArchivesSpace public-facing site. A little bit about myself. I am a freelance web developer based in Charlottesville, Virginia. Previously, I was at the University of Virginia Library for a number of years, where I was involved with ArchivesSpace in its early infancy. And I think in part because of that, I began a collaborative partnership with the Atlanta University Center in 2015, where they were in the process of transitioning to ArchivesSpace and doing a lot of migration and testing work. So my role was mostly software upgrades and a lot of configuration and testing support. But they did approach me just prior to their public launch with a very interesting project. And so that's where this image carousel plugin was born. So to give you a little further context, the idea was to do the public launch in September of 2018, so almost 2 years ago. And Brittany Newberry came to me with a list of feature requests. And most of those were in the nature of branding the pages, some user interface improvements to improve engagement with the site. And these were all pretty straightforward changes. Most of them were static in nature, so adding frequently asked questions and an about page, that sort of thing. But it did catch my eye that there was also the suggestion for adding an image slideshow or carousel on the welcome page. And Brittany very helpfully provided me with a couple of prototypes that we could start from. So these are already out there in the world. Even in 2018, the Virginia Military Institute and the University of Louisville Library were hosting carousels on their home pages. And this is an excellent way of showcasing material that you would like your patrons to explore. And being a curious programmer, I right-clicked on these to see how they were built, and it all looked very familiar. So I had kind of a light bulb moment. I hadn't been doing a lot of ArchivesSpace work at that particular point in time, but this was a very reassuring discovery. It turns out that these are Bootstrap carousels. So Bootstrap is integral to ArchivesSpace and is responsible for a lot of the user interface widgets that you see throughout the site. It makes development a lot easier. So there was no need to reinvent the wheel in this case. The proposal was to put a Bootstrap carousel on the welcome page. And that all seemed pretty straightforward. It's a great off-the-shelf component. It has good functionality and is a very time-tested component. So this would keep the development work to a minimum. But it did start a thought process about how and why we might improve on a static rendition of the carousel on a single page. Those pages are hard-coded, so the typical use case is that the URL pointing to the images in the carousel are written into the HTML, but we have the option to dynamically fetch them. We do that with all kinds of information in ArchivesSpace already, so I thought it might be worth exploring in this particular case. And the reason for that is my role as a freelance developer, as somebody who came and went from time to time on specific projects. Were I to provide a hard-coded carousel, my concern was that if anybody wanted to do changes, they'd have to get in touch with me. And so there'd be a lot of back and forth, and it would be much more sensible to allow people who are already managing their archival collections to have some control over their carousel. So with that in mind, the proposal was made to provide an extra interface so that staff could change the images, reorder them as desired. This would have the added advantage of not requiring you to restart the server, and as I say, very, very minimal tech support. And finally, as I had never written a plugin before, as this project got a little more complex, it seemed like a little more fun. So I was really looking forward to the work, and there were some bumps along the road, but what we did do was I'll show it shortly, but it was a lot of fun to make, and I learned a lot along the way. With that in mind, I wanted to offer a few general thoughts as a technologist about the plugins in ArchivesSpace. As I mentioned before, I was involved in the early parts of the project and then went and did some other projects for a while and came back to ArchivesSpace after a few years. And I was really delighted with what I saw. There was a lot of growth in the developer community. There'd been a lot of work on the application, and the plugin ecosystem in particular, I think, is something to be really proud of. The ease of use and how quickly you can spin up a plugin for very little effort is something that I think is a real advantage for this whole software system. And because of the way a plugin like this develops, where you copy over existing code from the application itself, the ArchivesSpace code base forms a very effective guide, a style guide and a best practice guide to help developers make code that is consistent with what other people are doing. And I think that's going to make these sorts of things much more maintainable over time. And along with that, it'll ensure that there are as few side effects as possible. So it's a very safe environment, especially for people who don't have deep experience with ArchivesSpace at a programming level, to write a plugin because there is this safety net underneath you. So I just wanted to sort of give a shout out to the community about that. This particular plugin does have a structure. So the architecture of it should look fairly familiar because it's similar to the architecture of the overall application itself. It touches a number of subsystems. So the public-facing side offers a few new pages, a modified welcome page, most notably having a carousel in it. And that's been separated out into a partial, so it could be dropped into another page easily enough. And it also has some controllers that have read-only access to the image URLs that you're storing in ArchivesSpace. On the staff front end, it's a little more involved. There are some pages to allow you to create, read, update, and delete carousel image data. So that's precisely what you need in order to select a change in your carousel. These permissions are circumscribed, so it's not the case that every authorized user can do this. And I think that's another added value to this, is that it's controlled to people who have a restricted level, a higher authorization level within the system. So it restricts access to the people who really know best about what the public-facing site should look like. On the back end, there's a small API, both for the authorized create and read-write application, and for the public side to fetch the data to be displayed on the page. There's also a very small change in the addition of a data model for carousel images. So that adds a table to the database. And that's pretty much it. It doesn't touch the indexer. And you just have a small new bit of data sitting alongside your main database that allows you to control this carousel dynamically. So with that being said, I will show you the finished product, first of all. So this is the page as we launched it in September of 2018. As you can see, it has a fair amount of branding along the header, but off to the right, you'll also notice that it has a scrolling carousel, which shows 5 images from our collections. And the carousel functions pretty much as you'd expect. There are previous to next buttons. There is the addition of some dots at the bottom to allow you to select specific images within. That's all out of the box Bootstrap, no programming required. As a sandbox, I wanted to showcase what it looks like without the AUC branding. So this is ArchivesSpace 2.8 that I'm running locally. And this is the carousel out of the box. A word about the choice of images. This is something that I've picked up over the years, like a lot of other web developers. I find placeholder images to be very useful. It helps you abstract away from your own chosen content and address layout and styling issues before you put in place the final product. So these fill images or placeholders come from a site that I like to use called Phil Murray. So that's a very helpful developer tool. There's many others like this, but if you want to have a little fun while you're doing rapid prototyping, Phil Murray allows you to pick different images. This is one we'll use in a moment, that allow you to view a tool without being distracted by the richness of your own content. So that's the public side. For the staff, if you log in as a user with elevated privileges, so here I'm an admin user and I have the ability to create and select repositories and do various system tasks. There's also a plugins menu. And so what this allows you to do is any and all staff actions for your plugins. And in this case, we just have the carousel. And it shows you a selection of the available images. So this is your listing page. If you wanted to create a new one, it's a pretty straightforward matter. You can just grab any URL that resolves anywhere to an image and pop it in and give it a title. Choose a role in the carousel, what order it should appear in. And if you don't want to use it, that's available as well. And if you go back to the listing, it's now available for use along with everybody else. If I wanted to edit an existing one, that's also pretty straightforward here. We could just take that out, pop in the new Bill Murray, change the title. And if we go back to the public side, refresh the page, there it is. So no restart required, no need to call IT support. You can do it yourself. And I think that is one of the major advantages of this approach. So that's it for the demo. So it was fun to write, it was fun to test. I hope it's fun to use. To talk very briefly about some of the features. Along the way, when I was looking at the Bootstrap page, it was clear that you could add titles and captions to the photos. Now, we decided not to go forward with that, but as you saw in the staff interface, there is a title field and a description field. Apart from it just being a very sensible thing to do in an archival context to have some metadata, I think it serves two uses. It helps the staff quickly discern which image is which within a larger collection, so that can be useful. And if the decision is made at some future time that you have a need to put a caption or a title overlaid on top of one of those slides, it should be a pretty straightforward matter to do. And I have provided an example in the code base. So in addition to this dynamic carousel, I did include a copy of the straightforward static one that doesn't actually talk to the backend. And in there, there's an example of of one that can actually pull a title and description from the locale file that comes with ArchivesSpace. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this if you want to enhance the presentation of these images. From a technical standpoint, separation of concerns was something that I wanted to talk about just briefly. It was important to me that we add this plugin functionality without touching the repositories themselves. So this sits alongside it, but it is not indexed material. It is not tied up with any particular collection or digital object. And the idea was that because this is a presentational plugin, it should be separate from the maintenance of archival information. So we took some care to keep these two things apart. And so it shouldn't have any effect on your underlying business logic. And finally, we did also make an effort to keep it simple. The carousel as it exists has been extracted from our own local customizations, which were also in the form of a plugin. And as it stands right now, it is hardwired to serve up 5 images. It was certainly possible to make it a little more flexible, so we could have a user interface that might choose how many slides to incorporate in the carousel. But since that wasn't a feature that was really desired by our stakeholders, it seemed best just to keep things simple and again, keep development time to a minimum and get this out into the world, which we did. And so far, I think everybody's been very happy with it. As far as possible next steps, and this really depends on the level of interest out in the world, I do think it would be worthwhile to make the mobile experience a little better. I think in general, the carousel could be a bit more responsive. We're focused on presenting portrait style images, much like the prototypes we saw elsewhere. But the carousel could and should handle landscape images or any of the different kind of geometry, perhaps a little better than it does. As I mentioned, it will also be a nice feature to have to be able to select a number other than 5 for your slide set. And I think that we could probably make some improvements for accessibility. I'd like to give a shout out to the team because this was a joint effort and I really enjoyed working with my colleagues. So Brittany Newberry took the lead both in terms of outlaying the requirements of this plugin, but also testing and quality assuring it. So special thanks to her. She'd also be a very good person to address any questions about it if you'd like to know how it's been working these last 2 years. But I'd also like to thank Cliff Landis, Christine Wiseman, Sarah Tanner, and Kevin Banks, all of whom were a treat to work with. And I think we're all really happy with the way things worked out. So yeah, that's our dynamic carousel. And you can see it at our main site, or you can check out the code, which I've put on Bitbucket. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. That was great. All right. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and Alex, when you are ready, please feel free to share away.
I'm going to take a second here. There it is.
Yeah.
All right, great. And you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Excellent.
All right.
Yeah, so good afternoon. I'm Alexander Duray, the metadata archivist at the New York Public Library. And a large portion of my responsibilities is managing our ArchivesSpace implementation at the NYPL. And today I'm going to talk about a plugin that we developed to automate date parsing within ASpace. So our implementation of ASpace ran from 2014 until we went live on July 4th, 2017. And we previously were using a locally developed FileMaker database for managing our archival description. And during their implementation process, we had a couple of sort of like high-level goals that we had to guide our implementation. For example, one of the things that we really wanted to avoid while implementing ASpace is we wanted to avoid having a lot of repetitive data entry throughout the application. So while we were implementing ASpace, one of our sort of guiding principles was we don't want to be worse than FileMaker. We don't want people to say, oh, ASpace is okay, but the old way was really a lot better for real processing, so we're going to stick with that. We wanted metadata creation to be sort of cool and fun and interesting, and not so focused on tedium. In addition, we want to minimize a lot of the complexities of processing while we could. We found that if there are too many fields, that you're faced with while doing metadata entry, it can often be intimidating and confusing, no matter how experienced you are with the application. And in addition, we wanted our data to be very high quality and complete, but we didn't want archivists, while processing, to have to make a lot of sort of tiny edits and fill a lot of repetitive fields. It's very easy to make tiny mistakes, punch in 1999 as a expression and 998 as your controlled form. I want to sort of automate those whenever possible. And in addition, we want to maximize the machine readability of our metadata. ASpace has a lot of really fantastic features, such as built-in calculators for dates and extents, that are really fantastic and phenomenal, but your data has to be machine readable first to sort of take advantage of those. And in addition, if our data was already machine readable in ASpace, then once we generated our MARC and EAD exports, it meant that the data was going to be really fantastic on export. So one field in particular that sort of gave us some concerns were default date forms. We found that the expression and the begin and end fields sort of encouraged doing double data entry, or we really wanted to use the begin and end to make sure that our dates were machine readable. But in doing so, it meant that, okay, either you skip the expression entirely, in which case you don't get nice human readable dates, or you have to punch your data in twice. It's kind of a lot to ask for archivists who are processing thousands and thousands of components in a given collection. In addition, date parsing can be a little sort of complicated. Different people can have different ideas and interpretations of rules and practices. So things like, for example, the 2000s or the mid-1990s or spring 1974, these can kind of mean different things to different people. So you weren't necessarily guaranteed to be consistent across expressions. And again, dates are only really machine readable if you're using the begin and end, which are great. I mean, you wanted these to be filled out, but then for complicated things like 2000s or kind of fuzzy dates like the mid-90s, it can get sort of difficult to read and really interpret, understand what the relationship of the data is to the archival material. So what we did was we sort of went and reviewed the existing functionality for date parsing. And as it turns out, our archives portal, which we use as our discovery and access platform, has it had a built-in library for parsing out parsing archival metadata. We found that we had this library called Time Twister, which was originally developed by Trevor Thornton and Matt Miller. And then I extracted it out into a standalone Ruby library, or a gem. And this was already in Ruby, and we were already using it to parse our archival dates. To give you an idea of what Time Twister did for us, it essentially parsed most free text dates that we had into ISO 8601. It would handle things like sort of very standard dates like October 1965, but also could handle fuzzy dates like the mid-1990s or spring 1974, which can be very common in archival description. In addition to sort of parsing out the date expression itself, it would also apply certainty qualifiers based on the mod standard. So for things like circa, it will pick up that it's an approximate date and put that into the certainty field. And then for things like brackets, well, these are now inferred, and that goes into the certainty. We've been using this in production since 2015. And it's parsed nearly 700,000 unit dates for us with no major issues. And you can sort of see an example of Time Twister in action, where it took this date, CA 1965, October 24th, and turned it into this these nice EAD attributes for machine readability. So we asked ourselves, well, we need an automatic date parser in ASpace, and we have an existing automated date parser in our archives portal, and it's already in Ruby, which ASpace wants. So what if we just take our existing library and implement that into ASpace as a plugin? And what we ended up with was the time walk library, essentially an ArchivesSpace implementation of the Time Twister Ruby gem. And essentially what it does is when a record is saved, it'll transform whatever the free text expression is into nice controlled fields. So you can punch in something like CA 1965, October 24th, and you would get your nice begin, ends, certainties, calendars, eras, so on and so forth, without having to fill those out manually. And one of the benefits we found of this is that since we no longer really needed anybody to edit the sort of like the extended date fields, we can now just hide them from non-administrators. Since there's no real need for to go in and change them, we were able to streamline the SUI a bit by taking out these fields. We've included them for administrators in case something really does go haywire. Surprises happen. But we haven't really run into any issues where we've had to sort of manually go in and edit dates via the sort of the quote-unquote admin view. And to give you an example of an action, so we started with sort of this like kind of fuzzy date, circa 1878 to 1908. And you can see that the extended date fields are now hidden. You just get the expression and the type. And once this is saved, it saves and it keeps the expression that you put in, but also gives you the begin and the end, the type that you provided. Says that's creation date, that's approximate based on the circa, and then provides the era and calendar in addition. So what this means is that sort of this free text date that was punched in, now when we export EAD and mark, we now get these sort of nice machine readable fields. And in addition, when doing things like search faceting on our archives portal, I can say, okay, show me all components with, material from the 1880s. And now this will be picked up in search and returned it as a result. So the benefits of, what are the benefits of the time walk plugin? So now data entry is much, much easier for archivists. You just punch in the expression once, and then you're essentially complete for your dates. And in addition to making things easier over the long term for working in ASpace, it also has really helped training and learning ASpace as a new user. Since it's a lot less you had to think about while learning the application, our training now just says, put a proper, DAX formatted date into expression, and then you're done. It means that our dates are now consistently controlled across our entire instance. We can do things like using the collection level date calculator without any extra labor. So things like that, where now sort of we get all these bonuses now that we have all our nice machine readable dates. In addition, it means that we don't have data entry errors that happen just from, accidents happen. The begin may not necessarily line up with the expression. And by making everything machine generated, we've managed to greatly reduce that occurrence. And this also means that even as archivists may have different interpretations of dates and rules, it means that it won't impact machine readability. So for example, if I use, say, early 2000s as as an expression, and you use 2000 and 2003, as far as our search indices are concerned, they're essentially identical. It gets the same data, despite the fact the expressions may be slightly different. And what we found is that really what this helped is that not only it helps the SUI sort of live up to the ArchivesSpace slogan, where it really should be your friendly archives management tool. And by giving the user all this power without any extra work, it really sort of lives up to that standard. So if you want to install TimeWalk, what I can do is go to my GitHub page for it, go to the repository, and just copy the files into your ASpace's TimeWalk folder. Once you do that, just punch in add TimeWalk into your app config plugins list and restart the application. And since TimeWalk doesn't do any sort of data changes or data, or doesn't really touch any existing data, once you restart, you're immediately set to go to start enjoying it. Now, one caveat of this is that TimeWalk only works on newly parsed states. It won't go back and save over old ones. It's only really built to handle new data. So if you have an existing instance with lots of existing date records, it's going to be a bit of work to go back and sort of refresh them via the plugin. One way to do this is to open and save lots of your old records so that TimeWalk will parse them. I really don't recommend this. I'm not aware of any sort of tricks you can do in the SUI to sort of bulk save lots of records at once. If you find one, please tell me so I can add it to the documentation. One other thing you can do is sort of use this if you're either familiar with the API or looking for a way to sort of learn how to use it. You can use the API to essentially resave lots of records in one go. There's actually this great article from the Code for Lib journal in 2019 by Alicia Dedelic, which walks through this process of using the API and scripting to sort of take out records and resave them. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and listening today. Thanks to staff across NYPL for all the help and support in developing this plugin. And yeah, and thanks to everyone who's contributed to either the Time Twister or TimeWalk plugin. And yeah, thanks to you for listening today. For any contributions, if you have any feedback, ideas, questions, yeah, open during the Q&A. You can always send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. And if anyone in attendance has been to any of the recent webinars where TimeWalk has come up, and there have been several, now is your chance to get your burning TimeWalk questions answered during the Q&A, because we've got Alex here. All right, our next presenter is Corey Schmidt. Corey, go ahead and share your screen when you're ready. Corey is currently dealing with fire alarm testing where he's located. So hopefully this presentation goes off without a hitch. Take it away, Corey.
Thank you, Jessica. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you, and I can hear no fire alarm.
Okay, let's hope that stays that way. So thank you very much for allowing me to present today. I greatly appreciate it. And before I get started, I want to give a great shout out to everybody at UGA, especially my supervisor, Adrian Hansen, Sean Kuehl, who helped me with this project, as well as the ArchivesSpace community. You guys are absolutely fantastic, and it's been awesome working with you guys. So I'm the ArchivesSpace project manager, and basically at the University of Georgia, we are migrating from Archivist Toolkit to ArchivesSpace. And during that process, I created this little tool to help with a workflow that we have, which was to export EAD records, do some cleanup on that, and then upload it to our Finding Aid website, which is based on XTF or Extensible Text Framework. So I thought today I'd give you basically a demo of the program. If you want to learn more about the thought process going into it, I highly recommend another presentation that I gave at the metadata and digital objects section in SAA. That was last week. So let's go ahead and get started. Basically, the first things that you need to know about the program is that if you want to batch export records, this is, and do it on demand, this is the application for you. If you kind of want to get check it out, first you want to drop by the GitHub, which hopefully you can see here. And if you are running on a Windows system, you are in luck because it is extremely easy to install and set up. All you have to do is go to the Releases tab here and download the most recent version, which is 1.0.1. Download this exe file. It will install for you, go through the whole Okay, my ears can barely hear now, so we'll go ahead and continue. Basically, just read the GitHub. It does work for Mac. You just have to do a bit more setup for that. So without further ado, let's go and see what the program actually does. So after installing it, you'll be met with this pop-up screen here. You will input your credentials. So I'll go ahead and do. Okay, it.
Corey, while you're getting that sorted, let's go ahead and move into Q&A, and then maybe we'll take the last 15 minutes if your fire alarm testing has stopped for you to do a demo, because I'm really excited for people to be able to see this. But I know that this has to be very frustrating for you. So thank you for trying and for persisting, and we will, hopefully it will stop very soon. But while we wait, let's go ahead and tackle some of the other questions that were coming in to the Q&A. A lot of the panelists have been answering questions in the Q&A, have been typing in their answers, which is great and very helpful in case we run out of time. I am going to go ahead and read those questions anyway for people who are listening in and for people who may be watching this recording in the future. So even if your question has already been answered, I am going to go ahead and read it out loud. And then I ask the person who answered the question if you would unmute yourself and answer that that question again, or just summarize your answer. All right, so the first question we got was for Erich and Hannah. Is it possible to modify the Matchbox plugin to give extents in linear feet instead of cubic feet?
Yes, hey. If you or you know somebody who can alter that, that can be changed to calculate something else instead, like adding the widths together instead of the cubic footage. Thanks.
All right. Hannah, I only heard part of your answer, but I don't know if that was me. Okay, someone else asked if the sound was out. Hey, so Hannah, could you just summarize your answer again really quickly?
Apologies for that. Are you hearing me okay now?
I'm hearing you now. I don't know what happened.
Okay, well, there's no fire alarms here, but hopefully they're working. Yeah, I was just saying that there's nothing built into the tool, but you could change the JavaScript function that enables that calculation to instead calculate adding widths together instead of, doing the multiplication for the cubic footage. But it's not currently part of the tool.
Okay, thank you. All right, another answered question. For Joshua, have you had problems with crawlers overloading your site after publishing a sitemap?
This is Joshua. No, we haven't. But again, Dartmouth has a pretty robust infrastructure, and that might not be true for all sites, all institutions. I think you're going to get perhaps less. It's hard to say whether you get less traffic or not because you're providing a direct map to everything, so they only have to hit your site once to actually index that particular page rather than crawling through everything. So long story short, I'm not sure. We haven't, but I'm not sure if that'd be true for other institutions.
Thanks. Quick update on Corey. He just sent me a message that there's a fire truck outside. So I'm going to say that wasn't a test probably. And we will definitely have to have Corey come back and show us a demo of his tool another time. And Corey is still here as a panelist. Corey, you should probably go outside. Next question. Again, related to sitemaps. If you tick on the agents field, will it publish all your agent records or only the ones you have already ticked for publication? Basically, what I'm asking is, will records that you don't wish to make public remain not published?
This is Joshua again. The Sitemap plugin only reads from the database, so it doesn't make any changes to your data. So anything that you've chosen to be published will be reflected in the sitemap. Anything that you've chosen to remain unpublished will not be in the sitemap. The only place where that's not entirely true is for archival objects and digital object components, where you may have published an archival object, but it lives in a series that you actually haven't published. In that case, you won't see the archival object in your sitemap because it defers to the parent object.
Thanks. For the Rockefeller Center archives, how does the plugin account for oversized boxes that can fit on the shelf different ways? For example, a side might be the depth or the width, depending on the orientation of that box type on the shelf.
All right, so this is Eric. I'll answer this. So that is a good question, and it's something we struggle with sometimes, but we usually use the shorter side would be the width, and then the other side would be a depth. We also try to reference the box from the product catalog where we got it from and see how it was classified then.
All right, thank you. All right, this question is about the image carousel. Would the image carousel plugin translate to ArchivesSpace integrations such as ArcLight?
Yes, the design of this is supposed to be pretty open-ended. So anything that can query the back end in the same way that the public interface does should be able to get the carousel data. So if you've got an integration in your local ecosystem that can talk to the back end of ArchivesSpace, it should be able to fetch the carousel data, no problem.
All right, thank you. Brianna asked a question later in the thread, or a clarifying question later in the thread, asking, I meant to ask, will the image carousel only display on the ArchivesSpace PUI? We're using ArcLight as an integration for our PUI, but the image carousel would be great. Matthew, did you answer that sufficiently in what you just said, or?
Yes, I apologize. I had read ahead in the thread, so I kind of knew
Yeah.
what was being asked there. My first interpretation of the original question was more about looking at it the other way. So I think I answered both possibilities for integrations along the way.
Okay, good. All right, thanks. Again, for the image carousel, does the image resize automatically?
Yes, it does. As I believe I've explained in the thread so far, our use case was to have a specific geometry on the welcome page. So they were a certain width and height. And so it's been styled for that. And any image, regardless of its intrinsic size, will resize to fill that space. It brings up an important point, though. This is something that I've come across throughout my career. If you set a size that is a certain ratio on a web page, and then you decide to throw in a set of images that are different ratios, you're going to run into some tricky edge cases. So if the image you choose is not 4:3, but your frame is, then you're going to have leftover space, or the part of the image won't be displayed, or that sort of thing. So one of the things we discovered along the way was there was a need to curate the images we wanted on the page. You had to pick your 5. They had to look good at a certain width and height. And as far as accessibility goes, it also helps if lay of the for the visually impaired aren't really easy to see on the carousel. So some thought and care has to go into selection of your images.
Thanks. All right. Another question for the image carousel: can the pictures link to an associated ArchivesSpace digital object?
Yes, they can. They don't link internally, so you do have to go to that curation page and update the URL field. It won't happen automatically, but that was a design decision that I explained in the presentation. I really didn't want this to be digging too deeply into the internals of the system. But the images that we show at Atlanta University Center are part of the archive, and I simply cut and paste the URLs that I found inside the staff interface into the carousel image fields.
Awesome, thanks. The next 2 questions I'm going to read together, but they are both for you, Matthew. This question is about the image carousel plugin. Can a carousel image be added to collections to any level of description, or only the welcome page? And also, can the size of the window showing the carousel be changed, or can you reposition it?
Sure. I'll take those in reverse order. The size of the carousel can be modified. Our specific desire was to have it on the right side and 327 by 440 pixels, I believe. There's nothing to stop you from having some other kind of layout, and there's a simple CSS style sheet that governs all this. So it's a pretty straightforward matter to restyle it. And if you need to change the way the markup is to make it happen, again, you just have the welcome page and a small subsection of a page called a partial that is the carousel itself, and you can move that to present it wherever you want. So it can be changed in terms of how it looks on the welcome page. It can also be used on other pages. The way the plugin ecosystem works, I would simply take the page in question out of ArchivesSpace, put it in a similarly named file inside the plugin directory, and you could add the carousel there simply by cutting and pasting the one line in the welcome page that inserts it on the welcome page. So it should be quite modifiable and available for use on any page on the public site.
Awesome, thanks. All right, Corey has messaged me that he is back inside the building and it was a false alarm. So we're going to answer questions for 5 more minutes, and then at 1:30 Eastern, Corey is going to do his presentation. What an exciting day. All right, so this is for Alex. How does TimeWalk interact with the rapid data entry interface?
That's an excellent question. So long as it doesn't really matter where you're saving your data from, be it via the SUI, the RDE, EAD imports, Excel imports, as long as you're saving a date from anywhere, then TimeWalk will parse it out.
All right, thank you. All right, for Joshua, what are your metrics for testing the success of the plugin? Have you seen an uptick in traffic since generating a sitemap? Are you using Google Analytics?
Yeah, hi, this is Joshua again. We've only been using the plugin for a short time, and we pretty much launched that at the same time we launched our PUI. So we don't have a great baseline before and after comparison. From everything that I've read, having a sitemap is only a good thing. Mainly because it tells the crawlers explicitly where to go look for your content. And as far as Dartmouth, in future doing some sort of metric, we do use Google Analytics, but it might be hard to tell again because we've only recently launched the PUI and we launched it in tandem with the sitemap. So I'd be interested to see if other people have different, have better success stories.
All right, thanks. All right. For Alex, will TimeWalk simply ignore undated in the expression field, and does it understand a date entered month, day, year?
So it will ignore the word undated since it can't really do a whole lot with it. For dates that are sort of like, like say 12/31/1999, since that's unambiguous, it'll parse it out. But if there's any ambiguity as to which is the day and which is the month, it won't touch it. What it tries to do is if there's any sort of like guesswork or uncertainty on its part, other than, I suppose, the ones you put in via the certainty, it'll never try to sort of like make assumptions about your data. If it doesn't know, it'll just skip it over.
That's good. Another question for you, Alex. Does Time Twister cope with approximate as well as circa?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. A question, this will be for Alex. Date fields. Are archivists warned if they enter an approximate date that can't be parsed?
It's generally very rare that happens. Most of our dates that we couldn't parse are, like we mentioned before, ones that were sort of like really ambiguous and sort of, non-DAX compliant. If something does happen where you punch in a date with no, that can't be parsed out, you won't get, it doesn't do any sort of warnings, it just won't parse it. You can see in like the AD exports and like going through the view screen of the SUI, you can see that like something might be kind of funny, where there's no sort of like warning about it via data entry.
Thanks. All right, we are going to have to scrap Corey's presentation. I appreciate him trying really hard, but sometimes things are just beyond your control. So we have lots of time for questions. We do still have 2 more questions in the chat, but if you haven't gotten a chance to type your question into the Q&A yet, please feel free. So the questions that we currently have, first is for Matthew. Is the image selection random? Can you pick specific images to highlight areas, collections? What was the impetus for wanting rotating images on the homepage?
Those are some interesting questions. They're not random. That would be fun. But the images were chosen carefully by Atlanta University Center Library staff. So you can pick specific images to highlight your areas and collections, and that is in fact what we did. The version I showed off with the Phil Murray stuff, that was really just kind of showing off the technology itself. But the use case was to pick specific images that would showcase the collections themselves. Now, I wasn't privy to the internal discussions, so I can't speak directly to the impetus for this desire to have rotating images on the welcome page. But based on my general experience, I would say that this is a pretty typical strategy for improving engagement with a content-rich site. So the idea is that when somebody first visits your public-facing ArchivesSpace application, they see something, and more than just one thing, they see a series of things moving, which entice you to try the search interface, to learn more about the product, and to try to start using it. So I think it's an excellent strategy to pursue engagement. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to sort of take things to the next level, because I think in addition to having a sampling of your collections that you've got on the site, I think you should evergreen them and refresh things periodically. So that when users come back a year from now, they don't see the same thing they saw last time, and they again want to engage with your site.
Thanks, Matthew. You could just create a plugin that is strictly only Bill Murray images. I don't know if it would appeal, but it would be fun.
I think that's going on my personal website next.
All right, we did have one other question that was for Alex from Dean. On the time twister, you mentioned it would skip. Do I assume that you could go in and edit the fields in the plugin edition? Alex has said, I'm not entirely clear. Oh, okay, Alex, you're still typing. Would you like to chime in here?
Oh yeah. So the question is whether you can sort of like add in new date formats. Like for example, if you know that everything with slashes in it is going to be month to month, day, year. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to do that, to add in those right now. You would have to go in sort of deep into the plugins code to manually add those. But it's a really good idea for like a feature, sort of saying like being able to sort of like not like auto parse, but know that like certain fields are always going to be certain things that may not apply to other institutions necessarily, but you know will apply to your data. So that's a really good feature request.
Alex, Dean's followed up. You showed the little box that splits circa to 1878 and end DDDD.
Yeah, that was within the yeah, there's no sort of like special oh, I see. So what you could do is if you're signed in as an administrator, you can go in and you will get the full sort of date fields that you would see as if you didn't have a plugin installed. So that's the case where you would need an administrator to go in and sort of change things up. Alternatively, you know, it is an open source plugin. They can edit locally. So you could go in and take out the sort of UI changes. So you sort of have sort of the full power of the ASpace date forms, with in addition to the automated parsing.
Dean says thank you. All right, we don't have any active questions in the Q&A right now. We did have some people who were raising their hands in the attendee list. If you were raising your hand because you had something you wanted to contribute, please feel free to post that in the Q&A or either the chat. We will sort of stick around for a couple more minutes before we break early. But if you do have any more questions to ask, now is your chance.